We live in an era of unprecedented clarity. Orbiting satellites can zoom in to discern a car's license plate from space, while ground-penetrating radar peers scores of feet beneath the surface, painting vivid maps of long-lost cities. We have charted the abyssal depths of the Mariana Trench and the alien landscapes of Mars. And yet, here's a paradoxical, almost humiliating truth for our technologically advanced civilization. We remain utterly unable to locate the final resting place of the most powerful individual to ever walk this planet. We're talking about Genghis Khan, the architect of history's largest contiguous empire, whose burial site has remained the greatest archaeological enigma for nearly 800 years. This is no mere lost tomb. It is the chilling culmination of the most grandiose and successful information suppression operation in human history. And we're not talking about the humble burial of some nomadic chieftain lost to the boundless steppe. According to every chronicle, he was interred with honors befitting the sovereign of half the known world. Legends, each more vibrant and fantastical than the last, whisper of untold riches, the plunder of scores of conquered kingdoms buried alongside him. The death and interment of the conqueror of the universe were events of global magnitude, yet his final resting place was obliterated from the face of the earth so thoroughly that it dissolved into mere legend. Hundreds of expeditions, from daring 19th century adventurers to 21st century scientists deploying cutting-edge technology, have all met with abject failure. The supposed burial area, Mongolia's sacred Burkhan Khaldun mountain, has been scoured from top to bottom, yet it has stubbornly refused to surrender its enigma. So, let me set the stage and clarify the genre of our journey together today. This won't be just another swashbuckling Indiana Jones-esque tale of cursed treasures and daring escapades, nor a dry academic dissection of historical sources. Instead, this will be an intellectual thriller, an epic drama chronicling the collision of indomitable human will against the relentless march of time itself. We will endeavor to reconstruct the precise logic of those who undertook a nigh-impossible task, to forge a secret robust enough to withstand not only armies and tomb raiders, but also future civilizations whose technological prowess they couldn't even begin to imagine. This is a story of how an idea, born from profound fear and sacred reverence, proved mightier than granite, stronger than steel, and more elusive than any satellite technology. And what astounds me most here isn't the 8th-century-old secret itself, but the sheer audacity and monumental scale of the original scheme. We typically imagine secrets being guarded by intricate locks, cunning traps, or vigilant sentinels. But the architects of this particular enigma conceived of a strategy operating on an entirely different plane. They didn't merely hide a tomb, they annihilated the very ground it occupied. They reshaped the landscape, effectively rewriting the geography of an entire region, and carried out a purge of witnesses so monstrously brutal that it ensured absolute, eternal oblivion. This decision was so radical, so utterly total, that it transcends mere precaution, transforming into an act of sacred engineering, almost divine in its sweeping ambition. The impetus for such unprecedented secrecy wasn't rooted in a mundane fear of common grave robbers. For the Mongols of that era, the tomb of their revered ancestor was far more than a mere sepulchre. It was a potent spiritual anchor, a wellspring of strength, and a sacred bulwark for the entire nation. The desecration of the tomb by an enemy would signify not merely a sacrilege, but a spiritual catastrophe, the very annihilation of their empire. Thus, safeguarding this secret was a matter of supreme national and metaphysical security. It was a sacred duty that Genghis Khan's son, Agony, and his closest comrades were prepared to fulfill at any cost, even the most gruesome and bloody. They weren't merely constructing a tomb, they were engineering a fortress designed to withstand the siege of eternity itself. So, I invite you not merely to be a spectator, but an active participant in this intellectual investigation. We won't be wandering the steppe with shovels in hand. Instead, we will infiltrate the clandestine headquarters of this operation, pore over their blueprints, meticulously dissect their ingenious and brutal plan, and strive to comprehend the extraordinary logic that allowed them to triumph over the future. We will follow a faint trail woven from fragments of ancient chronicles, revealing satellite imagery and ground-penetrating radar data to ultimately glimpse the astonishing contours of humanity's most ambitious project to forge an eternal secret. Let's transport ourselves back for a fleeting moment to August of 1227. Imagine the thick, stagnant air of the Mongolian steppe at summer's end. A vast army, tens of thousands strong, returns from a triumphant campaign, moving in an unnaturally hushed, almost ringing silence. Instead of celebratory shouts and songs, there is only the muted murmur of voices, the creaking of countless arbor cartwheels, and the heavy, rhythmic breathing of horses. The air is saturated with a complex, palpable bouquet of scents, not the perfume of wildflowers, but the pungent blend of horse sweat, sour kumis, cured leather, the smoke from innumerable campfires roasting mutton, and the faint, sweetish tang of death hovering above the funereal cart at the heart of this moving city. This world was perceived entirely differently from our own. For a Mongolian warrior of that epoch, the primary sense organ wasn't the eye, but rather hearing and smell. He could discern the approach of a herd or an enemy detachment by the slightest shift in the wind's scent, and identify who fired a flying arrow, friend or foe, by its sound alone. His reality was woven from the creak of leather harnesses, the whinny of stout, resilient horses, the guttural chatter of dozens of dialects, the clang of weaponry, and the soft whispers of shamans communing with spirits. And now, within this mournful procession, all these familiar sounds were muffled, as if the steppe itself held its breath, sensing the profound weight of a loss that would irrevocably alter the course of world history. To truly grasp the logic of the people who engineered this greatest of secrets, we must attune ourselves to their wavelength to decipher the core codes hardwired into their consciousness. The first and foremost code was the concept of the eternal blue sky, Tengri. This wasn't a god in our modern understanding, not some abstract entity existing in a distant realm. Tengri was the all-encompassing, living law of the universe, the very sky above their heads, which observed everything and determined destiny. Genghis Khan didn't see himself as merely a conqueror. He was an executor of Tengri's will, its punishing sword, destined to unite all peoples under one sky. His authority wasn't merely political, it was sacred, almost divine. And the death of such a man was not simply the end of a life, but an event of cosmic magnitude. The second, equally crucial code was the cult of the earth and ancestors. For the nomad, the earth wasn't just territory or a resource. It was a living being, the deity Etugan, the giver of all life. And the spirits of ancestors didn't ascend to heaven or descend to hell. They remained in this earth to protect their lineage. The more powerful the ancestor, the stronger their guardian spirit. Genghis Khan's spirit was the ultimate protector of the entire nation he had forged. If an enemy were to find and defile his remains, they wouldn't merely steal treasures. They would strike a mortal blow at the very heart of the Mongolian people, stripping them of divine protection and condemning them to ruin. The secrecy of his tomb was a spiritual insurance policy for the entire empire. And the third code, binding everything together, was the Great Yasa. This was the legal code established by Genghis Khan. But it was more than just a constitution. The Yasa was a matrix, the operating system of the empire, regulating everything from military discipline to everyday conduct. Its core principle was absolute obedience to command and unwavering loyalty to the clan, where the interests of the collective vastly outweighed the life of any individual. A Khan's command was the command of Tengri itself. And if the will of the deceased Khan was for his tomb to vanish forever, that command had to be executed with absolute, ruthless efficiency, even if it required sacrificing thousands of lives. Now, having assembled these elements, we can draw a precise and confident analogy from our own world. The project to conceal Genghis Khan's tomb was no mere funerary ritual. It was humanity's first black project, a top-secret state-level operation comparable in its level of secrecy, the resources deployed, and its existential importance to the 20th century's Manhattan Project. The objective wasn't to bury a body, but to launch an immensely complex engineering and logistical mechanism of total oblivion. The stakes in this operation were higher than winning a war. The very existence of their world hung in the balance. The genesis, the singular catalyst that ignited this mechanism of eternal secrecy, was one fateful event. In August of 1227, during the siege of the Tangut Kingdom's capital, the heart of the planet's greatest empire ceased to beat. Genghis Khan was dead. This monumental fact was kept under the strictest veil of secrecy. The army continued its offensive. The city was ultimately conquered and razed to the ground, and only then did the funeral procession, carrying the Khan's body in a plain-covered arba, begin its slow journey homeward to Mongolia. At this critical juncture, his son and heir, Agony, and his most trusted generals faced not merely the task of burying a father. They confronted a fundamental engineering, theological, and governmental conundrum: how to safeguard the spiritual reactor of their civilization. The problem was compounded by the fact that while Mongols were geniuses of warfare, they were not masters of monumental construction. They built no pyramids like the Egyptians, nor grand mausoleums like their Chinese neighbors. Their entire culture was mobile, ephemeral as campfire smoke. Their palaces were yurts, their cities temporary encampments. To leave a massive mound or a visible tomb on the surface would be to create an ideal target. It would not merely be an invitation for grave robbers, but a direct challenge to future enemies who might seek to inflict a symbolic defeat by desecrating the remains of their greatest foe. The conventional methods of interring great rulers were not just unacceptable, they were tantamount to betrayal. And this is precisely where the engine of our entire story is born, an idea, revolutionary and incredibly audacious for its time, the concept of complete, total oblivion. Its architect was most likely Genghis Khan himself, who embedded its principles within his great Yasa. He, above all others, understood the nature of power and symbols. He knew that the most secure lock is its absence. The most impregnable fortress is one whose location no one knows. The grand design was not to hide the tomb. The design was to annihilate it as a geographic entity, to integrate it so seamlessly into the natural landscape that it would become an indistinguishable part of it. Not to build, but to erase. Not to create a monument, but to create a void. The chief executor of this titanic vision was Agony. He wasn't the military genius his father had been, but he was a brilliant administrator, a pragmatist to his core, who understood that the responsibility for preserving an entire legacy now rested on his shoulders. He could not afford sentimentality or halfway measures. He faced his father's command, the will of heaven, and an existential threat to his entire nation. And he approached this task not as a grieving son overseeing a funeral, but as the lead engineer on a super-complex, ultra-secret project. He assembled a tight-knit circle of his most trusted confidants, generals, shamans, and most crucially, captive engineers from the conquered Khwarezmian Empire, hydrology specialists whose expertise would be harnessed to subdue nature itself. This revelation had the impact of a silent bomb, detonating not with a roar, but with a profound hush in the minds of this select group of initiates. No one in the Mongolian elite, accustomed to solving any problem with brute force and weapons, had anticipated such a level of complexity and such an immense scale. The plan presented to them transcended everything they knew. It demanded not valor, but patience, not fury, but cold calculation, and not resounding glory, but absolute funereal silence. The reaction was not one of debate or doubt. That would have been unthinkable within the framework of the Yasa. Instead, it was a silent, tense comprehension of the colossal magnitude of the task and an unwavering readiness to execute it at any cost. The first practical stride involved establishing a colossal forbidden zone around the sacred peak of Burkan Khaldun, the Ich Korig, or Great Taboo. This territory, spanning hundreds of square miles, was cordoned off by the elite warriors of the Imperial Guard, the Keshig. Anyone who inadvertently crossed this invisible demarcation, whether a shepherd, a hunter, or a lost traveler, was summarily executed. This land was declared both holy and cursed, effectively wiped from the Empire's mental and physical maps. This marked the initial phase of the operation, cultivating an information vacuum, a pristine, clean room, perfect for the clandestine work ahead. Thus, the Great Khan's demise didn't usher in an era of mourning. Instead, it ignited a secret operation of unprecedented scale. This wasn't a declaration of war against another nation, but against time itself and the fickle nature of human memory. And the sheer scope of this conflict, its audacious engineering and its staggering moral cost, these were the elements that triggered an internal shockwave, transforming a mere burial into history's most ambitious project to forge an eternal enigma. They weren't just burying a man, they were burying a place. So the mission was clear, not merely to conceal, but to utterly obliterate the burial site itself. How could such a feat be accomplished? The plan devised by Ogedai's strategists was brilliant in its simplicity and monstrous in its execution. The central metaphor, the crucial key to unlocking the entire design, became the concept of enslaving the river. The Onon River, sacred to the Mongols and the very cradle of Genghis Khan's lineage, was not merely to bear witness, it was to become the primary instrument of concealment, serving as both gravedigger and eternal guardian. The audacious scheme was to compel the river to serve their purpose, then erase every trace of its collaboration. Let's lift the hood and dissect this incredible hydro-engineering operation. This was no mystical ritual, but a cold, precise engineering project brought to life by the hands of thousands of enslaved people and captured specialists. We won't use magical incantations, but rather the lexicon of construction and hydraulics, because that's precisely how the organizers thought. They didn't act like shamans, they were like foremen on a monumental construction site, where the cost of error wasn't merely a minor mishap, but the utter failure of a mission imbued with sacred significance. Let's visualize this process step by step. Step 1. Selecting the perfect location. Scouts and engineers discovered a unique spot in the Onon Valley, a place where the river executed several sharp bends, almost touching itself before rounding the base of the mountain. Such a natural loop presented an ideal canvas for hydraulic intervention. The distance between two sections of the riverbed here was minimal, drastically reducing the volume of necessary earthworks. It was akin to surgery, finding a precise point where one accurate incision alters the entire circulatory system. Step 2. Creating a temporary bypass channel. Tens of thousands of enslaved people, armed with the most rudimentary tools, hoes, baskets, perhaps even the brute force of oxen, began digging a colossal channel designed to connect the river upstream and downstream of the chosen loop. This was the most labor-intensive and conspicuous part of the endeavor. Simultaneously, at the beginning of the loop, a formidable earthen dam, reinforced with stones and tree trunks, was constructed to block the old riverbed. The objective was to completely drain a multi-mile stretch of the river. This was a temporary alteration of the landscape, destined for later obliteration. Step 3. Constructing the tomb on the riverbed. Once the multi-mile loop of the Onon was drained, the construction of the burial chamber began at its deepest point. We don't know its exact appearance, but it was evidently a monumental structure of stone and timber, designed to withstand immense water and soil pressure. The sarcophagus containing Genghis Khan's body, along with, according to legends, untold treasures, was placed within. Afterward, the chamber was sealed and buried under tons of earth and gravel, leveling it with the former riverbed. Step 4. Bringing the river back. This was the most dramatic and perilous moment. Upon the completion of all work on the riverbed, the Mongols demolished the temporary dam. The powerful flow of the Onon roared into its new, straight course, the channel they had dug. The old, drained loop, with the tomb secreted within, remained abandoned, transforming into a colossal dry gully. The tomb now lay not under the river, but in its place. The river became its first and foremost guardian, altering its path and leaving the burial site off to the side, forever concealed. And finally, step 5, total obliteration. This was the final and most brutal act. Thousands of enslaved people who built the channel and the tomb were exterminated. Then, the warriors who exterminated the enslaved people were themselves eliminated. The chain was broken. Afterward, the most meticulous work began. The old, drained riverbed, now housing the tomb, was painstakingly filled with earth. Trees, sod and shrubs were transplanted to completely restore the landscape's original appearance. Within a few years, as nature reclaimed its dominion, no one would ever be able to guess that a river once flowed there. The perfectly straight channel, dug to divert the water, would also, over time, erode, become overgrown, and transform into a barely discernible depression, indistinguishable from 1,000 others. The operation was complete. The place had vanished. We marvel at the genius of the conception, but behind every grand project lie not just ideas, but human hands, sweat, and blood. Let's get straight to a tangible fact, without any pandering to the audience. Each of the thousands of nameless enslaved individuals conscripted for this construction, through months of backbreaking labor, manually, with primitive baskets and hoes, carried on their backs enough earth to fill a modern Olympic-sized swimming pool to the brim. And the sole reward for this Herculean effort, for forging a marvel of engineering, was a swift and silent death by a Mongol warrior's sword. The foundation of history's greatest secret was literally cemented with human bones, and among this doomed multitude were their own unsung heroes, or rather, tragic geniuses, without whom the entire operation would have been impossible. These were the captive engineers from Khwarezm and Samarkand, people whose ancestors had for centuries constructed intricate irrigation systems in arid deserts, creating flourishing oases and erecting cities crowned with turquoise domes. They were the custodians of unparalleled knowledge in hydraulics, geodesy, and construction. And so, the cruel irony, their genius, intended for creation, was harnessed to forge absolute emptiness, to craft a masterpiece of oblivion. They were the intellectual powerhouse behind the entire operation. It was they, not the Mongol commanders, who traversed the Onon Valley with surveying instruments, calculating the ideal angle for the new channel. It was they who computed the structural integrity of the temporary dam, capable of restraining the might of a powerful river. They directed thousands of enslaved individuals, transforming a chaotic mass into a synchronized construction machine. One can imagine a venerable, white-bearded master from Samarkand standing on the bank, observing the progress. He, more than anyone, understood the elegance and audaciousness of this project. Perhaps deep down, he even admired its sheer scale. But this admiration was poisoned by a crystal-clear understanding. Once the final stone was set, he and everyone who had witnessed it would be eliminated. His greatest creation would become his own nameless tomb. Another crucial, yet unseen force comprised the warriors of the Imperial Guard, the Keshig. Their role extended beyond simple security. They were the nervous system and the security detail of this black project. Their duties encompassed unimaginable logistics. They had to covertly transport tens of thousands of people to the site and supply them with everything necessary for months, all while maintaining a regime of absolute isolation. They patrolled the perimeter of the Great Taboo, ruthlessly eliminating any accidental witness. And it was they, at the very end, who became the executioners for the builders, and then, perhaps, for each other, to narrow the circle of the initiated to an absolute minimum. Their loyalty was not merely discipline, it was fanatical, forged by the laws of the Yasa. They were perfect instruments for safeguarding the secret because they asked no questions. And here's a striking, everyday detail that helps ground this entire immense undertaking. We envision a monumental construction project with powerful machinery, but they had nothing but muscle power and the simplest tools. This entire colossal volume of earthwork, which altered the river's course, was accomplished using bronze-tipped shovels, hoes, and woven willow baskets. Every single ton of earth was dug and moved by hand. This detail is shocking in its incongruity. The grandeur of the objective versus the primitiveness of the means. It makes their achievement even more incredible and underscores the inhumane price that was paid for it. The entire operation to conceal the tomb was akin to crafting a clockwork mechanism where every single cog had to function flawlessly. The enslaved people were the muscle, the captive engineers the brains, and the Keshig guard the iron will that propelled everything forward. Ogeday's genius wasn't in conceiving the plan, but in his ability to assemble and activate this monstrously efficient machine, comprised of individuals doomed to oblivion. This is precisely why, when we speak of Genghis Khan's tomb, we're not just talking about him. We're talking about tens of thousands of nameless builders, engineers, and warriors whose lives became the final, most impenetrable layer of defense, shielding the great Khan's secret. Their collective demise became the ultimate lock that no one has managed to pick in the subsequent 8 centuries. It seemed the most complex and brutal phase of the operation was nearing its conclusion. The engineering design had been executed with impeccable precision. The drained riverbed had transformed into a colossal pit where the burial chamber was already concealed. Tens of thousands of doomed laborers were completing the final preparations to restore the landscape to its pristine state. The system operated like a perfect, merciless machine. Only 2 final orders remained: to release the river into its new course and to initiate the total, multi-stage purge of all witnesses. And it was precisely at this juncture, on the very precipice of success, that the well-oiled mechanism encountered a force no engineering plan could have foreseen, the will of the eternal blue sky itself. The perfect storm didn't begin with a slave rebellion or an enemy attack. It descended from the heavens. In the clear light of day, with the sun at its zenith, a thunderstorm of unthinkable, unnatural intensity unleashed its fury upon the valley. The sky turned black in mere minutes. Wind, howling down from the mountains, ripped yurts from their moorings and knocked horses off their feet. But this was no ordinary hurricane. Lightning struck not haphazardly, but with terrifying precision, repeatedly slamming into the peak of the sacred mountain, Burkan Khaldun. The earth beneath their feet trembled, and the Onan, still restrained by the temporary dam, swelled and blackened like an enraged dragon struggling to break free of its chains. For the Mongols, whose worldview was saturated with belief in signs and omens, this was more than just a natural disaster. This was the voice of God, the wrath of Tengri. In the ensuing chaos, one of the most influential shamans, a man whose word on spiritual matters carried as much weight as a military commander's order, emerged from the crowd of high-ranking dignitaries. He addressed not Ogeday, but the warriors frozen in superstitious terror. His voice, amplified by the thunderclaps, sounded like a death sentence. He declared that they had gone too far. They were not merely burying the great Khan, they were committing sacrilege. By enslaving the sacred river and scarring the land at the foot of the holy mountain, they had angered not only the spirits of this place, but also the spirit of Genghis Khan himself, who wished no such sacrifice. The great Khan did not desire his eternal rest to be guarded by a defiled nature. This was a direct, public challenge to Ogeday's authority and his grand design. And here, a terrifying paradox of their might and their weakness came crashing into view. The entire Mongol war machine, the very empire itself, was built upon absolute, almost automatic obedience to command, codified in the Great Yasa. This unwavering principle was their supreme power, enabling them to achieve the seemingly impossible. Yet now, that very strength had turned against them. Ogedei's command originated from earthly authority, from the legitimate heir. But the shaman's pronouncements appealed to celestial power, to the will of Tengri and the spirit of the deified founding father. And thousands of Keshig warriors, paragons of obedience, suddenly found themselves caught in a paralyzing cognitive dissonance. Whose decree held ultimate authority? Whose will were they bound to obey? That of the son, or that of the father's spirit? Ogedei, the pragmatist and empire builder, found himself ensnared in a monstrous trap. He gazed upon the raging elements, the shaman's inspired face, and the frozen, indecisive visages of his elite guard. He understood this was no mere theological dispute. This was rebellion, thinly veiled as prophecy. This was an audacious grab for spiritual authority at the Empire's most vulnerable juncture. Any move he made risked cataclysm. To order the shaman's seizure would be to declare himself an enemy of the gods in the eyes of his own army. To yield to the shaman's demands and halt the work would mean failing his father's paramount directive and losing face, and with it, his very power. For several long, tension-filled minutes, the entire monumental project ground to a halt. Time itself seemed to hold its breath. On one scale of the cosmic balance lay cold engineering calculations and the will of the deceased emperor. On the other, primal terror of divine wrath and the authority of a man claiming to speak for the heavens. Tens of thousands of people, frozen beneath the roaring sky, awaited whose will would prevail. The iron discipline of the Yasa collided with the irrational dread of the supernatural. The entire operation, brought almost to completion, hung by a thread, and the fate of history's greatest secret now hinged not on the strength of the dams or the loyalty of the guardsmen, but on the outcome of this clash of wills between the pragmatic prince and the rebellious prophet. And the paramount question hung in the air, deafening more profoundly than any thunderclap. How could one compel people to obey a command if they were convinced that command had been cursed by the gods themselves? Before we delve into how Ogedei resolved this crisis, let's hit pause and examine the situation from another angle, exercising a measure of intellectual honesty. That dramatic scene I've painted, with the tempest and the shaman, is founded on later, semi-mythical sources. However, another, more pragmatic theory exists, advanced by some historians. According to this perspective, there was no divine intervention whatsoever. The shaman's revolt was nothing more than a subtly orchestrated political spectacle staged by Ogedei himself. And why? To resolve a very earthly rather than spiritual problem. A faction among the Mongol nobility viewed this entire engineering endeavor as overly complex, exorbitantly expensive, and, crucially, out of step with ancestral traditions, which dictated that chiefs be buried simply in a secret location without such titanic efforts. This alternative theory posits that Ogedei, confronted with quiet sabotage and the grumbling of the aristocracy, leveraged a natural phenomenon, a typical severe thunderstorm, as his pretext. He himself subtly deployed a loyal shaman to vociferously declare the will of the heavens, which, by astonishing coincidence, perfectly aligned with Ogedei's original blueprint. In one brilliant stroke, he silenced all dissent, elevated his engineering project to the status of a sacred divine mandate, and effectively muzzled every opponent. It was a masterful political manipulation, transforming an act of nature into a tool for cementing his authority. We may never truly know the full truth of what transpired, but the mere existence of this version underscores the intricate undercurrents within the Mongol elite. Now, let's step away from the political machinations and turn our attention to the economics of this ambitious undertaking. We speak of treasures, yet rarely do we fully grasp their true magnitude. By the most conservative estimates, based on the inventories of conquered cities. The value of the gold, silver, precious gems, and silks interred with Genghis Khan was utterly colossal. To put this into more relatable terms, this sum would have been sufficient to pay the wages of the entire Mongol army, a force exceeding 100,000 warriors, for a full 10 years. With these riches, one could have constructed a fleet of 1,000 ships, capable of dominating all trade routes from China to the Persian Gulf. This was no mere gold reserve. This was strategic capital that Ogedei deliberately and permanently removed from the empire's economic circulation. But why? This leads us to the hidden meanings, to the profound symbolism of these actions, which far transcended their material value. The burial of these treasures was not an act of vanity, but a ritualistic performance. First, it served as an accounting to the eternal blue sky. Genghis Khan was, in essence, returning to Tengri the share of the spoils rightfully belonging to the heavens, which had granted him victory. He sacrificed the material to ensure the spiritual well-being of his people. This was the most expensive insurance policy in history, purchased from the gods themselves. Second, it was a potent political manifesto addressed to his heirs and the entire imperial elite. By burying vast fortunes, he demonstrated that the empire's true wealth lay not in gold, but in unity, discipline, and unwavering loyalty to his decrees. It was as if he declared, "Do not let this glittering tinsel poison your souls and destroy what I have forged. Do not squabble over plunder. Instead, continue my work." It was a lesson against avarice, delivered with truly imperial grandeur. And finally, the deepest symbolism lay in the very act of enslaving the river. In Mongolian mythology, the dragon was the master of aquatic elements, a mighty and untamed spirit. By compelling a river to alter its course and become the guardian of the tomb, the Mongols were not merely hiding a body. They were performing a symbolic act that elevated their ruler, their earthly dragon, above the forces of nature itself. They did not ask nature to conceal him, they commanded it. This was Genghis Khan's final, posthumous demonstration of absolute power, a power that extended not only over peoples and kingdoms, but over mountains and rivers alike. And now, having witnessed the audacious engineering feat of subjugating a river, the silent tragedy of thousands of builders who became the very foundation of the secret, the cold political calculation capable of transforming a natural disaster into an instrument of power, and the sacred awe that propelled this entire mechanism, the picture emerges clear and whole. We have gathered all the pieces of the puzzle, and now we can fit them together to finally perceive not just isolated facts, but the entire architecture of this colossal project. We are ready to answer the ultimate question with which all of this began. How did they pull it off? What, then, is the secret behind this 8th-century-old phenomenon? It isn't a single trick, not a secret map, nor a lost burial mound hidden in the mountains. The genius of this plan lay elsewhere. Its creators understood that to forge an eternal mystery, one had to commit not one, but 3 perfect crimes simultaneously. A crime against geography, a crime against memory, and a crime against the very idea of searching. They crafted a multi-layered defense system where each subsequent layer was more sophisticated and less tangible than the last. The first was the perfect engineering crime. They did not hide the tomb in the landscape. They rewrote the landscape itself. Diverting the river and subsequently recultivating the terrain was not mere camouflage. It was an act of physical obliteration of the original starting point. They left no traces because they destroyed the very place where those traces could have existed. It's like tearing a page from a book and burning it. It's impossible to read what no longer exists. Any satellite or ground-penetrating radar seeks an anomaly, a deviation from the norm. But they created a new, flawless norm. The second, following on its heels, was the perfect informational crime. They understood that the most unreliable keeper of a secret is a human being, and they resolved this problem with extreme, horrifying efficiency. The multi-stage execution of everyone involved in the work, from the lowliest slave to the executioner guardsman, was not merely an act of cruelty. It was the most perfect data deletion operation in history. They didn't just sever all the threads, they burned the very spool from which those threads could have unraveled. They created an absolute informational vacuum, a hermetic void into which not a single word, not a single rumor could seep. But even that was not enough. The most dangerous enemy remained: future generations, their curiosity and their technology. And against this enemy, they committed the third, most subtle, perfect psychological crime. The creation of a forbidden zone, the Great Taboo, was not merely the setting of boundary markers, it was the programming of collective consciousness. For centuries, this territory was imbued with an aura of sacred dread. People feared not just venturing there, they feared looking at it. They feared even thinking about it. They erected a mental barrier, an invisible wall of fear and reverence, which proved more enduring than any stone masonry and outlived the empire itself by centuries. And now we see the solution in its full, stunning scope. Genghis Khan's tomb isn't a pinpoint on a map. It's the culmination of an intricate multi-stage process whose ultimate objective was the self-annihilation of any information about itself. They didn't simply place treasure in a chest and lock it away. They dissolved it into the river, into the earth, into fear, and into the silence of the dead. The paradox is that we cannot find this greatest of monuments because its primary architectural principle was complete, absolute absence. Its triumph lies in its invisibility. This transcends mere politics or warfare as we typically understand them. This is a design of titanic, almost divine scale. It was an audacious attempt not just to outwit robbers or enemies. It was a bold endeavor to impose their will upon time itself, to create a secret capable of resisting the erosion of centuries and the pervasive knowledge of future civilizations. They weren't seeking immortality for a body. They sought and created immortality for a mystery. And looking back at this from the vantage point of the 21st century, we are forced to admit they succeeded. Our technologies falter before their will. We search for an object, but they left us only its perfect absence. We seek a signal, but they created a flawless, eternal static into which that signal dissolved without a trace. They crafted a masterpiece of invisibility, and in this lies their ultimate, still unsolved triumph. It might seem that the legacy of a project whose goal is complete oblivion is a paradox, but this is precisely where the plot thickens. The domino effect, set in motion almost 800 years ago, has reverberated into our present in the most unexpected ways. The first and most direct consequence was the creation of the Great Taboo, the forbidden zone surrounding the sacred mountain, Burkhan Khaldun. For centuries, this territory remained off-limits, initially through fear of the law and then by the power of sacred tradition. No one logged the forests here, no one grazed livestock, no one hunted. And while wars raged, dynasties changed, and empires rose and fell all around it, this particular corner of the earth remained in its pristine, untouched state. As a result, the act of concealing one man's tomb paradoxically preserved the life of an entire ecosystem. Today, this region is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, a veritable lost world where scientists study nature as it existed before large-scale human intervention. The greatest act of death gave birth to a unique sanctuary of life. But the most astonishing legacy of this project isn't what lies buried beneath the earth. It's what has blossomed within the human mind. We draw upon it constantly, often without even realizing. The very tale of Genghis Khan's secret tomb has evolved into a powerful cultural archetype, a veritable holy grail for all seekers of adventure. Every time you watch a movie or play a game where heroes search for a lost tomb filled with untold riches and deadly traps, think Indiana Jones or Lara Croft, you're encountering a distant echo of that original engineering feat on the Onon River. It was that project which forged the quintessential model of the perfect mystery, becoming an inexhaustible wellspring of inspiration for all of adventure culture. The mere notion that somewhere out there remains one last grand, unsolved enigma continues to ignite our imagination. For modern Mongolia, the undiscovered grave has become one of the foundational pillars of its national identity. Genghis Khan is more than just a historical figure. He is the nation's founding father, its eternal protector. And the fact that his eternal rest remains undisturbed is perceived as a sign of special divine favor and a symbol of the country's spiritual strength and sovereignty. The Mongolian government's refusal to permit any excavations in the sacred zone, despite its potential tourism and scientific value, isn't mere obstinacy. It's a profoundly powerful political and cultural declaration. It proclaims, "There are things more important than gold and scientific curiosity. The will of our ancestors is sacred to us." Thus, an empty spot on the map has become for Mongolians a more significant and unifying symbol than even the most opulent mausoleum. And here we arrive at the central paradox of this legacy. The initial idea was defensive, to conceal the tomb so perfectly that no enemy and no plunderer would ever be able to locate and desecrate it. Secrecy was the shield. Yet over 8 centuries, that shield has transformed into the world's most potent magnet. It is this absolute mystique that has rendered Genghis Khan's tomb the most coveted archaeological prize on the planet. The more securely it was hidden, the more intensely curiosity was stoked. The aspiration for utter oblivion birthed worldwide renown. Perfect protection forged the most alluring target. What's more, the original intent was to create eternal peace and silence. Agony wanted his father's name to be associated with his deeds and his resting place with absolute quietude. What was the eventual outcome? 8 centuries of unceasing noise. Legends, theories, expeditions, books, films, all of these generate an information field of incredible density. Any renowned mausoleum, from Tutankhamun's tomb to the Taj Mahal, is a place of stillness and contemplation. Genghis Khan's grave, though invisible and unheard, is paradoxically the loudest resting place on earth. Emptiness, it turns out, spoke more eloquently than any monument. Thus, Genghis Khan's true legacy is not merely the empire he forged, nor the treasures lying beneath the earth. His legacy became this very grand, self-sustaining mystery. It is a monument not to a man, but to the sheer power of human will, capable of defying the very passage of time. And this invisible monument teaches us a simple yet profound lesson. Sometimes, the greatest impact on the world comes not from what we can see and touch, but from what will forever remain beyond the bounds of our comprehension. Let's draw a clear bridge from the 13th century to our 21st. We live in an age of total data capture. Every step we take, every click, every photo leaves a digital footprint that is virtually impossible to erase. We strive for the right to be forgotten, attempting to scrub unfortunate comments or youthful photos from the internet, and more often than not, we fail. Now, imagine people who, 800 years ago, possessing nothing but sheer muscle power and an unyielding will, managed to permanently expunge from reality not just a blog post, but an entire geographical site, along with the most powerful person of their era. This contrast is astonishing and compels us to ponder the very nature of information and mystery. Our civilization is obsessed with the idea of absolute transparency and readily available knowledge. We believe that every riddle must be solved, every secret unveiled, every blank space on the map filled in. We strive to catalog, digitize, and make everything publicly accessible. And in this pursuit, we risk losing something profoundly important: a sense of the sacred, an awe before the unknown. The Mongolians faced the opposite challenge: not how to know everything, but how to make one supremely important thing absolutely and eternally unknowable. And their success stands as a silent rebuke to our overconfidence. And it is here, at the crossroads of 2 eras, that the tomb's story imparts its primary, unconventional lesson. It lies in the understanding that true value and power are not always found in presence, visibility, and knowledge. Sometimes they reside in their complete opposite, in controlled absence, in deliberate void, in a carefully guarded mystery. We live in an attention economy where value is determined by views and likes. The Mongolians crafted a masterpiece of the silence economy, where the grandeur of an object is directly proportional to its inaccessibility and obscurity. This principle extends beyond history. The greatest power in music often lies in the pauses between notes. The expressiveness of a painting is defined not only by what is depicted, but also by the empty space surrounding it. A person's wisdom is measured not only by what they say, but also by what they choose to keep silent about. The story of Genghis Khan's tomb is the largest historical example of the power of negative space. An empty spot on the map proved more significant and influential than any grand mausoleum they could ever have built. Therefore, when we speak of the failure of hundreds of expeditions, this isn't a story of our technological shortcomings. It is a story of their philosophical triumph. They created not just a hiding place, but a material embodiment of the idea that some things should remain beyond human interference. It is a monument not to vanity, but to humility. Humility before the will of ancestors, before the forces of nature, and before eternity. And perhaps the most crucial lesson of this story for the 21st century is that to attain true wisdom, one must not only know how to find answers, but also respect the mysteries that were never meant to have them. In a world bent on eradicating every shadow, this narrative reminds us of the value and beauty of one perfectly preserved shadow, within which rests the spirit of a great empire. To grasp the full scope of the Mongolian design, we must temporarily leave their encampment and view them through the eyes of those they crushed. And here, we must immediately discard the caricatured image of the barbarian. The civilizations that fell before the onslaught of Mongolian cavalry were not primitive tribes. Take, for instance, Khwarezm, from where brilliant engineers were taken to construct the tomb. This was a hub of science, art, and commerce. In its cities, Samarkand and Bukhara, the world's greatest astronomers and mathematicians worked. It was there that modern algebra was born. Their libraries groaned under the weight of priceless manuscripts, and their markets teemed with silks from China and spices from India. This was an ancient, sophisticated, and incredibly proud civilization, with its own truth, its own law, and its own vision of world order. Now imagine them, the Mongolians, bursting into this ordered, flourishing world which lived by the rhythm of changing seasons and the slow movement of caravans. In the eyes of a Samarkand resident, this wasn't merely the invasion of an enemy army. It was an apparition from another infernal realm. They seemed not human, but a force of nature, a human plague of locusts descended from the wild eastern plateaus. An alien, sharp scent of horse sweat, sour milk, and unwashed bodies emanated from them. They spoke in guttural, barking tongues that sounded like animal growls. They didn't construct siege towers. They drove throngs of captives before them, using them as human shields. They didn't value gold as much as they valued water, and they could wipe out a city of 1 million people with cold, businesslike indifference. This was absolute culture shock, a collision not with another army, but with another biology, with another planet. So, what constituted this fundamental difference? The civilization of Khwarezm, much like China and Persia, was built on the principle of stability and accumulation. Their strength lay in the stone walls of their cities, in centuries-old irrigation canals, in libraries housing the wisdom of generations, and in complex hierarchical structures. They valued what could be built, preserved, and passed down. The Mongolians, however, were the embodiment of absolute mobility. Their power lay in their rootlessness. Their home was a felt yurt which could be packed up in an hour. Their wealth was their herds, which moved with them. Their fortress was not a wall, but the speed and the empty expanse of the steppe where they could vanish and reappear hundreds of miles away. Settled civilizations cherished roots. The Mongolians valued the wind. And here we arrive at the tragedy of predictability. All the strengths of the settled empires became their greatest weaknesses in the war with the Mongols. Mighty fortresses? They turned into traps, concentrating populations and resources in a single point, ideal for siege and total annihilation. Large, well-organized armies with heavy infantry? They were too slow and unwieldy to catch the fleeting detachments of Mongolian cavalry who would strike and then vanish instantly. A complex system of governance and bureaucracy? It was too inert to react to lightning-fast changes in the situation. Their order, their predictability, their faith in immutable rules of warfare became their death sentence. The cultural shock ran even deeper. The Khwarezm Shah and his generals simply couldn't comprehend Genghis Khan's logic. They were accustomed to wars with rules, rituals, opportunities to negotiate, to buy peace, or to arrange dynastic marriages. The Mongols offered none of this. Their ultimatum was simple and terrifying: complete, unconditional submission or total annihilation. They used terror not out of blind rage, but as a calculated instrument of state policy, the most effective form of psychological warfare. This cold, calculating cruelty, devoid of any emotion, was something utterly alien, inhuman to the Khwarezmians. And now we can understand the full depth of the tragedy of the captured Samarkand engineer. This man, whose civilization prioritized creation, building for the ages, crafting visible, tangible beauty, was forced to apply all his genius to a project that was the complete antithesis of everything he believed in. He was ordered to create a masterpiece whose sole purpose was absolute invisibility and eternal oblivion. This was not merely slavery. It was a violation of his civilizational code, a perversion of the very essence of his being. Therefore, looking from the other side, we see that the Mongols won not because they were stronger or more numerous. They won because they were different. They brought with them a new type of thinking, a new philosophy of war and power, for which the old, ordered civilizations were completely unprepared. Their tragedy was that they tried to stop a tsunami by building a stone wall in its path. They were crushed not by force, but by the very logic of history, which at that moment gambled not on order, but on chaos. Genius always comes at a price, and beneath the elegance of the engineering solution for concealing the tomb lay its monstrous, dark underside. The most difficult and morally ambiguous decision Ogedei had to make was the final act of the entire operation. This wasn't about executing slaves. In the logic of that era, it was predictable and even commonplace. This was about the order to annihilate thousands of warriors from the elite Keshig Guard, the very men who had just executed the command to eliminate the builders. These were the most loyal, most devoted warriors, the Khan's personal guard, his steel shield. And Ogedei, following the relentless logic of total oblivion, condemned them to death. This was not merely a cruel order. It was an act of icy, calculating betrayal, committed in the name of a higher purpose. Let's peer into the inner world of Ogedei himself. We picture him as an all-powerful ruler, yet during those months, he was likely the most solitary person in the empire. The weight of responsibility rested squarely on his shoulders, not only for executing a project of immense engineering complexity, but also for safeguarding a sacred secret upon which the fate of his entire world hinged. He couldn't share his doubts, his fear of failure, or his revulsion toward the tasks he had to perform with anyone. Every single day, he issued commands that led to thousands of deaths, all while maintaining an impenetrable mask of confidence. This monstrous burden inevitably transformed him. The Ogedei who began this operation, a grieving son intent on fulfilling his father's final wish, became a different man by its conclusion. He morphed into a function, the high priest of a bloody cult of oblivion. Emotions became an unaffordable luxury. He was compelled to view people not as comrades or subjects, but as potential threats, as carriers of dangerous information that needed to be zeroed out. Any idealism, if it ever existed, burned to ashes, leaving behind only the scorched earth of pragmatism, where the end not only justified but dictated any means, no matter how inhumane. And on the altar of this success, not only anonymous slaves, but also his closest companions were sacrificed. Imagine a man named Arslan. He was more than just a general. He was Ögedei's under, his blood brother, a friend from childhood. And it was Arslan who commanded the Keshig units responsible for the cordon and subsequent cleanup operation. He was Ögedei's right-hand man, his eyes and ears on the ground. He was privy to every detail of the project, knowing each stage, every twist of the new riverbed. He was the most loyal, the most dependable. And precisely because of this, in the logic of this diabolical system, he also became the most dangerous. When the last slave was executed, when the last executioner guard was put to the sword, only a tiny circle of initiates remained. And Arslan, friend and blood brother, was part of that circle. The machine of oblivion they had created now demanded one of its own creators as a final sacrifice. Ögedei faced an unthinkable choice: preserve his friend's life and leave a living witness in the world, thus violating his oath to his father, or see the undertaking through to the end, sacrificing the last vestige of his own humanity. History hasn't preserved the details, but we can envision their final conversation. A wordless exchange in complete silence where everything was understood with a single glance. Arslan, as a true warrior of the Yasa, comprehended the inexorability of the command. His loyalty was absolute, loyalty not to Ögedei the friend, but to Ögedei the Khan, the executor of Genghis Khan's will. He, without coercion, accepted his fate, becoming the last, eternal guardian of the secret. And Ögedei gave the order, with his own hand signing the death warrant for his past, his friendship, his very soul. Thus was the true cost of genius paid. The operation's success was absolute. The secret was preserved. But Ögedei, though he became a great Khan and solidified the empire, forever remained a man who, upon a foundation of bones from thousands of loyal individuals and one devoted friend, built an invisible mausoleum for his father. And this unseen mausoleum became simultaneously a monument to his fealty and a monument to his personal tragedy. When the Mongol tide receded, leaving behind the ruins of great cities, the most peculiar and unpredictable process in history began. The inevitable clash of two worlds, two utterly distinct operating systems of consciousness, took place. Imagine a Mongol governor, a nomad just yesterday, riding into the opulent palace of a Persian emir in Bukhara. He sees elegant arches, walls adorned with intricate mosaics, and fountains in cool courtyards. Yet, to him, all of it is merely dead, inconvenient stone. He orders the priceless furniture removed, a felt rug laid over the marble floor, and his yurt pitched in the center of the throne room. A yurt in a palace. This image is no mere anecdote. It's a perfect metaphor for that initial conflict. It was a collision of the world of mobility with the world of monumentality, of the world of wind with the world of stone. This conflict permeated everything. The Mongols, primarily Tengrists, practiced a pragmatic religious tolerance. Their interest lay not in which god you prayed to, but whether you paid your taxes diligently. In their capital, Karakoram, one could witness a Buddhist pagoda, a mosque, a Nestorian church, and a shamanic shrine, all in the same square. This wasn't a synthesis, however, but rather a bazaar of faiths, where everyone peddled their own salvation. For the conquered peoples, accustomed to the inseparability of state and religion, this was a shock. How could one rule without imposing one's gods? How could one be so indifferent to questions of truth? This Mongol tolerance, born of cold calculation, initially struck them not as broad-mindedness, but as barbaric godlessness. But over time, from this harsh, uncomfortable coexistence, the most astonishing and peculiar hybrids began to emerge. In Persian miniature painting, renowned for its sophistication and canons, Chinese dragons, clouds, and mountain landscapes suddenly appeared, brought over by the Mongol rulers, for whom Chinese culture held greater prestige. Architects, conscripted from all corners of the empire, began to incorporate elements observed from Chinese masters into the construction of mosques in Central Asia. A unique imperial style emerged, a bit Mongol, a bit Persian, a bit Chinese. This wasn't harmonious eclecticism, but rather a whimsical yet potent mutation, giving rise to something entirely new and viable. The grandest hybrid of all became the empire's governance system itself. The Mongols took their iron military discipline and rapid communication network, the famous Yam postal service, and overlaid it onto ancient trade routes like the Silk Road. Thus was born the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace. This was a hybrid system where nomadic military might provide security for settled trade. For the first time in history, a person could travel safely from Hungary to Korea with a single document, the Mongol paisa or passport. The idea of a nomadic empire managing global trade, that was the most striking hybrid spawned by that era. So, how did this change the life of the average person? For the merchant from Genoa or Venice, a golden age dawned. The risk was immense, but the profits were astronomical. He could bring silk and porcelain from China, paying customs duty only once at the empire's border, and then travel under the protection of Mongol law. For the artisan, fate was more dramatic. He might be forcibly abducted from his native Samarkand and brought to Khanbalik, the future Beijing. He lost everything. But in his new location, he suddenly found himself in a melting pot, working side by side with masters from across the globe, exchanging techniques and creating things that would have been inconceivable in his old, isolated life. And what about the peasant? His life at first glance changed little. He still tilled the land, only now taxes were collected not by a local feudal lord, but by a Mongol official, the Darugachi, who did so far more efficiently and ruthlessly. But along with this official, new goods, new words, and even new ideas seeped into his remote village. The world for him suddenly expanded to unbelievable limits. He suddenly realized that his village wasn't the entire universe, but merely a tiny grain of sand in a gigantic empire, governed from a distant, almost mythical capital. This shattering of centuries-old isolation was the primary upheaval brought by the new hybrid civilization. The operation to conceal the tomb was merely one part of a far more sweeping campaign. Genghis Khan and his heirs were not just conquerors, they were propaganda geniuses, intuitively understanding that an empire rests not only on swords, but also on myths. They deliberately constructed the public image of their leader using every available means. The main tool was deification. Even during Genghis Khan's lifetime, the legend of his divine origin from a celestial wolf and a beautiful doe was launched. And his birth was associated with an omen. He was said to have been born clutching a blood clot, resembling a seal, a symbol of future power. After his death, this myth was magnified manyfold. Genghis Khan ceased to be a man. He became the embodiment of the eternal blue sky's will, an earthly deity whose name could not be uttered aloud without a special ritual. This propaganda worked on two levels. Within the empire, it forged a cult of personality, cementing national unity around the sacred figure of the founding father. Any rebellion against his heirs automatically became not a political crime, but an act of sacrilege. Externally, this image functioned as a potent psychological weapon. Enemies had to contend not just with an army, but with a demigod favored by the heavens. Whispers of his supernatural abilities, of his understanding the language of beasts and birds, were spread by Mongol scouts far ahead of the advancing army, paralyzing the will to resist even before the battle began. But for every propaganda, there's always a counter-propaganda. Conquered peoples, stripped of the ability to resist by force, waged their own information warfare. They engineered a smear campaign, constructing an image of Genghis Khan as absolute evil, as the Antichrist, a scourge of God sent to punish humanity's sins. Persian and Arab chroniclers, in describing the Mongol invasion, spared no dark hues. They wrote of rivers of blood, mountains of skulls, and depicted the Mongols as the demonic hordes of Gog and Magog, emerging from the underworld to destroy the world. These accounts were not merely descriptions of cruelty, but an attempt to explain the inexplicable, to fit this catastrophe into their own worldview. And many of these myths, born in the fire of counter-propaganda, have survived to this day and become firmly entrenched in popular consciousness. For instance, the famous quote attributed to Genghis Khan, "The greatest pleasure is to vanquish your enemies, to seize their possessions, to see their loved ones in tears, and to embrace their wives and daughters." It sounds remarkably colorful. The problem is, this phrase first appears in Persian sources many decades after his death, and not a single Mongol source corroborates it. Most likely, it was a clever propaganda ploy, crafted by his enemies to portray him as a ruthless and lecherous savage. But the myth proved more powerful than historical truth. And here's the most vivid example of how history is written by the victors. Let's take a pivotal event that triggered the war with Khwarezm, the so-called Otrar catastrophe. According to the official Mongol version, detailed in The Secret History of the Mongols, Genghis Khan dispatched a large trade caravan with peaceful envoys to Khwarezm. But the governor of the city of Otrar, suspecting the merchants of espionage, ordered everyone killed and the caravan plundered. This treacherous murder of envoys became the pretext for a righteous, avenging war. In this narrative, the Mongols are the victims of aggression, bringing retribution. However, archaeological evidence and an analysis of Persian sources paint a completely different picture. It's likely that the trade caravan wasn't so peaceful after all. It contained a disproportionately large number of warriors and behaved provocatively. The governor of Otrar, most likely, acted not out of greed, but for security reasons, thwarting a well-organized intelligence operation. But the Mongol propaganda machine brilliantly exploited this incident, turning everything on its head and creating a perfect casus belli, a reason for war that presented them in the most favorable light. The official version, written by the victors, became canonical and for centuries shaped our perception of these events, even though the reality was likely far more complex and ambiguous. The empire, forged by Genghis Khan and cemented by the blood and iron will of his heirs, had reached its zenith. It stretched from the vast Pacific Ocean to the rugged Carpathian Mountains. The system hummed with efficiency. The Yam postal relay system, an ancient equivalent of express mail, seamlessly connected its sprawling territories. The legendary Silk Road, once fraught with peril, now lay safer than it had ever been. And the Yasa, Genghis Khan's formidable code of law, though undeniably harsh, imposed an unprecedented order across these lands. It seemed the initial grand vision, to unite all peoples under the benevolent gaze of the eternal blue sky, was finally on the cusp of realization. Yet, precisely at this pinnacle of power, the intricate machinery of the empire began to falter. A virulent strain of arrogance and an insatiable hunger for power started to corrode it from within. And soon, a fatal decision was made, one that irrevocably twisted the great idea and became the irreversible turning point, sealing the empire's ultimate doom. This pivotal decision was Genghis Khan's grandson, Hulagu's relentless march into the Middle East. His ultimate target was Baghdad, the illustrious capital of the Abbasid Caliphate. But this was no mere wealthy city. For 500 years, Baghdad had pulsed as the very heart of the Islamic world, its intellectual and spiritual beacon. It was home to the fabled House of Wisdom, the greatest academy and library of its age, a sanctuary where the works of Aristotle and Plato were meticulously preserved, and where Arab, Persian, and Jewish scholars forged groundbreaking advancements in mathematics, astronomy, and medicine. Genghis Khan, for all his brutal ruthlessness, was a shrewd pragmatist. He obliterated those who resisted, but he spared and integrated those who submitted, especially scholars and skilled artisans. Hulagu, however, intoxicated by a string of effortless victories, chose a different path. He decided not merely to conquer Baghdad, he resolved to erase it from existence. The ends no longer justified the means. The means, utter annihilation, had become the end itself. The symbolic act that marked this cataclysmic shift was the wanton destruction of the House of Wisdom. This was no mere act of vandalism. It was a war waged against the very essence of knowledge. Legend tells us that countless manuscripts, meticulously gathered over 5 centuries, were dumped into the Tigris River. So vast was their number that the river's waters reportedly turned black from the ink washing off the pages. It was a monstrous metaphor. The Mongols, whose power lay in their relentless movement and Spartan simplicity, were drowning the wisdom and memory of a great, sedentary civilization in the river. The second symbolic act was the execution of the last caliph. According to Mongol tradition, the blood of a noble person was not to be spilled upon the earth. Therefore, the caliph, the spiritual leader of hundreds of millions of Muslims, was wrapped in a rug and trampled to death by horses. Thus, by adhering to the letter of a single minor superstition, they committed an act of sacrilege on an unprecedented scale, forever poisoning relations with the Islamic world. This decision ignited a profound internal schism within the Mongol ranks themselves. News of Baghdad's fall reached another of Genghis Khan's grandsons, Berk, the formidable ruler of the Golden Horde. But Berk, unlike his cousin, was more than just a Mongol Khan. He was a devout Muslim. For him, Hulagu's actions were not merely a brutal act of war. They constituted a personal affront to his faith, the murder of his spiritual father, and a trampling upon everything he held sacred. Ideals clashed violently with pragmatism, which had curdled into outright cynicism. The conflict between these two erstwhile allies, these two pillars of the empire, became utterly inevitable. Berk, remaining steadfast to the principles of religious tolerance and justice laid down by their grandfather, dispatched a furious message to Hulagu, one that resonated through history. He has plundered all the cities of the Muslims and brought about the death of the caliph. With the help of Allah, I will call him to account for so much innocent blood. This was no mere threat. It was an outright declaration of civil war. One grandson of Genghis Khan, who believed their grandfather's legacy was a boundless right to conquest, stood in direct opposition to another, who held that this legacy was a solemn duty to forge a just world order. Thus ignited the first large-scale war in history, pitting Mongol against Mongol. A brutal conflict erupted between the Golden Horde and the Ilkhanate, the realm forged by Hulagu. The formidable military machine, built to conquer the world, now turned inward for the first time, beginning to devour itself. The sword that was meant to carry the Yassa's law to every corner of the earth was now stained with fratricidal blood. The dream of a unified global empire, governed from a single center, perished precisely there, on the battlefields where the armies of Berk and Hulagu clashed. The original grand vision had been utterly betrayed. The secret of Genghis Khan's tomb was meant to safeguard the spiritual core, the sacred heart from which the empire drew its strength and legitimacy. But now, with the very idea of the empire perverted, when conquest for plunder replaced conquest for order, this spiritual center lay desolate. The tomb on the Onon River still cradled the founder's body. Yet his soul, his guiding ideal, had been murdered and trampled by his own grandsons on the banks of the Tigris. The physical mystery remained intact, but its profound meaning was forever lost. When the dust of the great conquests finally settled, the world it unveiled was unrecognizable. Ancient social pyramids, standing for centuries, had been swept away and utterly demolished. The primary losers in this harsh new reality were the representatives of the old, hereditary aristocracy, the Chinese mandarins, the Persian emirs, the Russian princes. Their power had been rooted in land ownership, ancestral lineage, and sacred right. The Mongols, for whom these held no value whatsoever, stripped them of land, power, and even life in a single brutal stroke. Yesterday's rulers, whose word was once law, were at best transformed into silent tributaries. At worst, their heads adorned the skull towers that became the grim calling card of the new order. So, who were the winners? At the apex of this new pyramid, of course, stood the Mongol military nomadic elite. Simple warriors who had grown up in the dusty steppes became governors of the richest provinces, their chieftains rulers of entire kingdoms. But beneath them emerged a completely new, unprecedented social layer, an international elite of useful people. These were not warriors. They were Uyghur scribes, forming the backbone of imperial bureaucracy, Persian financiers who streamlined the tax collection system, Armenian and Italian merchants whose knowledge of trade routes was invaluable, Chinese engineers and physicians. Their rise was based not on bloodline, but on competence. In this brutal, yet in its own way meritocratic system, it mattered little who your father was. All that mattered was the benefit you could bring to the Khan. Thus, on the rubble of old aristocracies, a new, pragmatic, and cosmopolitan elite was born. The economy of this new world was literally built on bones. The first stage was a colossal, historically unprecedented redistribution of wealth. Material and human resources were systematically stripped from conquered centers, Samarkand, Baghdad, Kiev, and rerouted to the Mongol heartland, to the capital of Karakorum, or to new regional hubs like Sarai Batu on the Volga. This was not mere plunder. It was a forced reformatting of Eurasia's entire economic map. Old centers of power, which had thrived for centuries at the crossroads of trade routes, were either obliterated or reduced to remote backwaters. But in the second stage, destruction gave way to construction. The colossal resources gained from plunder were reinvested into creating history's first truly global logistics network. The Mongols understood that controlling trade was more profitable than simply raiding caravans. Under the protective Pax Mongolica, the Great Silk Road transformed into a safe and bustling transcontinental highway. A unified system of postal stations was established, taxes were standardized, and universal travel documents, the paisas, were introduced. As a result, trade routes shifted, spawning new growth points. Venice and Genoa grew fabulously wealthy from trade with the East, while a once obscure town like Tabriz in Iran suddenly became one of the world's richest metropolises, a global hub where merchants from every corner of the earth converged. How did these monumental upheavals alter the psychology of those who lived through them? For the generation that witnessed the Mongol invasion firsthand, it was a collective trauma of apocalyptic proportions. Their entire world had crumbled. City walls that seemed eternal fell in a matter of days. Armies, once deemed invincible, were scattered like smoke. Rulers, whose authority seemed divine, were humiliated and executed. This bred a profound sense of fatalism and powerlessness in the face of destiny. The world ceased to be an orderly, predictable place governed by divine providence. It now appeared chaotic, cruel, and utterly devoid of meaning. Yet, for their children and grandchildren, born within the Mongol Empire's expansive embrace, the world map was entirely different. They knew nothing of old borders or ancient fears. For them, reality was a vast, unified world, traversable with safety from the Black Sea to the Yellow Sea. Their worldview was imperial, global in scope. A merchant from Novgorod could conduct business with a trader from Beijing. A Nestorian monk from Persia might become the great Khan's ambassador to the court of the French king. There was an explosive proliferation of geographical and cultural knowledge. People suddenly grasped the immense scale and diversity of the world beyond their valley or city. The lamentations over a lost past gave way to a dizzying sense of new, limitless possibilities. Thus, by passing through fire and blood, humanity took a painful yet monumental stride toward its current globalized state. Behind every great empire lies not just an army, but also a grand idea. And the Mongol war machine was fueled not only by a hunger for spoils, but also by a potent philosophical engine that rendered them virtually invincible. The central concept that governed everything was the doctrine of the eternal blue sky, Tengri. For the Mongols, this was more than just a religion. It was a holistic cosmological and political theory. According to it, just as there was only one eternal god, Tengri, in the heavens, so too there should be only one supreme ruler on earth, the great Khan. Genghis Khan and his descendants were not merely fortunate conquerors. They were the executors of a divine destiny, instruments through which Tengri established order on earth, uniting all warring peoples under one sky. This idea transformed wars of conquest into a sacred mission and death in battle into martyrdom for a higher purpose. The intellectual engine, the power behind the throne of this era, wasn't a single philosopher, but an entire institution, the shamans. They were the interpreters of heaven's will. They wrote no treatises. Their wisdom was passed down orally, yet their influence was immense. They read omens in the cracks on a scorched sheep's shoulder blade, in the flight of birds, in thunder and lightning. A shaman was not merely a priest. They were a political advisor, a physician, and a psychologist rolled into one. A pivotal figure in the empire's early days was the mighty shaman Kokochu, known as Teb Tengri. It was he who, at the great Kurultai of 1206, proclaimed Temujin as Genghis Khan and declared him the chosen one of the eternal sky. He bestowed divine legitimacy upon his rule, transforming a tribal chieftain into the sovereign of the universe. However, shamans were not only a source of legitimacy, but also a potential threat. The story of Teb Tengri himself provides a perfect illustration. Over time, his influence grew so vast that he began to lay claim to power, asserting that he communicated directly with heaven, bypassing the Khan. He started to sow intrigue, turning Genghis Khan's own brothers against him. It was then that Genghis Khan demonstrated who was, in fact, the supreme interpreter of divine will. He summoned Teb Tengri to a challenge where, according to Mongol custom, his spine was broken without a single drop of blood being shed. This brutal execution was a philosophical statement. Shamans were merely conduits, but the source of power and its sole bearer was the Khan himself. The idea was a tool of power, not its master. Standing in stark contrast to this simple, fierce, and all-encompassing doctrine of one heaven, one ruler, was a radically different philosophical system, especially prominent in China. This was Confucianism. While the Mongol worldview was a philosophy of power, Confucianism championed a philosophy of harmony. At its very heart lay the concept of the mandate of heaven. The Emperor of China, too, was regarded as the son of heaven, but his mandate to rule was far from absolute. It was strictly conditional. As long as the emperor governed with wisdom and virtue, maintaining harmony throughout the Middle Kingdom, heaven smiled upon him. However, should famine, epidemics, or rebellions break out across the land, this was seen as a clear sign that the emperor had forfeited his virtue, and the mandate of heaven could be revoked. Authority was granted not for global conquest, but for the meticulous preservation of internal order. This clash of ideas was far from theoretical. It became the primary battleground once the Mongols swept into China. Genghis Khan's grandson, Kublai, who would eventually become the Emperor of China, found himself at a pivotal crossroads. He could rule as a traditional Mongol Khan, relying solely on military might and the ancient Yasa law. But to govern such an incredibly complex, ancient bureaucratic civilization with the raw, unyielding laws of the steppe was simply impossible. It would have been like trying to operate a sophisticated computer with a blunt hammer. His Chinese advisors, steeped in Confucian texts and wisdom, fervently urged him to embrace their system, to restore ancient rituals, champion scholars, and govern through the well-established ranks of Mandarin officials. Ultimately, Kublai was compelled to forge a compromise, a decision that would indelibly shape the destiny of his Yuan dynasty. He remained the great Khan of the Mongols, yet simultaneously embraced the title of Chinese emperor, thereby establishing a new dynasty. While he and his court continued to speak Mongolian and adhere to steppe customs, for the actual governance of the vast nation, they co-opted the sophisticated Chinese bureaucratic machine. The result was a peculiar, fascinating hybrid. The fierce universalist ideal of Tengri was thus compelled to don the brocaded ceremonial robes of Confucianism merely to retain its grip on power. In this way, the philosophy that had seemingly lost on the battlefield ultimately achieved a quiet, administrative victory, slowly yet inexorably digesting and assimilating its conquerors. Immediately following the death of Ogedei, Genghis Khan's chosen successor, something within the grand mechanism of the empire irrevocably fractured. A system designed for perpetual expansion now confronted an intractable problem. How does one govern a world that has already been utterly conquered? It was much like a colossal wave, which upon crashing onto the shore loses its formidable energy and dissolves into 1,000 tiny rivulets. Entropy, the universe's relentless force of decay, began its inexorable work. There was no external enemy powerful enough to shatter this immense might. The empire began to devour itself from within, fracturing under its own immense, self-generated weight. Its primary strength, the absolute centralization of power in the hands of a single individual, ironically became its Achilles heel. Without the founder's indomitable will, the centrifugal forces of disunity began to tear it asunder. The struggle for succession escalated into a permanent state of civil war. The great Kurultai, the esteemed assembly of Mongol nobility, transmuted from a legitimate mechanism for electing a new Khan into a virulent battlefield for rampant ambitions and insidious intrigues. Genghis Khan's sons and grandsons, hardened by a life in the saddle and utterly accustomed to absolute command, refused to bend their knee to one another. Each of them governed their own ulus, a colossal domain carved from the very flesh of conquered lands, and each saw himself as the sole, true inheritor of the grand vision. But now, each interpreted this vision to serve his own burgeoning interests. The Yasa, once the unified and unshakable law of the land, was now twisted into a mere instrument in the ruthless struggle for power, its very words selectively quoted to justify any treachery. The drama reached its dramatic crescendo in the generation of the grandsons. They were not merely carving up territories, they were tearing apart the very soul of the empire. Kublai in China, envisioning a future forged through fusion with ancient, settled civilization, built a brand new capital in Beijing and surrounded himself with Confucian sages. His cousins in Central Asia and along the banks of the Volga viewed this as nothing less than the gravest betrayal. For them, Kublai was an apostate, a turncoat who had bartered the rugged valor of the steppe for the effeminate luxury of palaces. Berke, the ruler of the Golden Horde, converted to Islam and declared a holy war against his cousin Hulagu for the wanton destruction of Baghdad. The once unified body of the empire was ripped into 4 warring uluses, each charting its own course, embracing its own religion, cultivating its own culture, and forging its own distinct destiny. The dream of a unified world under a single Khan devolved into a bloody nightmare of fratricidal slaughter. Armies that were once meant to bring order to the wild peoples on the fringes of the known world now clashed in furious pitched battles against each other across the lands of Persia and the Caucasus. The finest generals, whose very names struck terror from the Adriatic to Korea, were now busy burning each other's cities and trampling each other's fields. It was a tragedy of Shakespearean proportions, A generation of conquerors proved utterly incapable of preserving what their fathers and grandfathers had so painstakingly won. Yet, amidst this agonizing demise, there emerged a final hero, a last shard of that original monolithic idea. His name was Kaidu. He too was a grandson of Genghis Khan, and he reigned over the heart of Asia, the Chagatai Ulus. For his entire life, spanning more than 3 decades, he waged an implacable war against Kublai. Kaidu was the living embodiment of the ancient Mongol spirit. He disdained cities, wore simple garments, slept in a yurt, and believed that his grandfather's true legacy was eternal movement, a life lived in the saddle, not one spent languishing on a Chinese throne. He was the last to seriously attempt to turn back the tides of history and restore a unified nomadic empire centered squarely in the steppe. His struggle, though grand, was ultimately doomed. He became the rallying point for all who disagreed with Kublai's Sinicization. He was the last guardian of the true faith in Tengri and the Yasa. His death in battle in 1301 marked the symbolic end of an entire epoch. After him, no one dared to challenge the relentless process of disintegration. The idea of a global Mongol empire died with him. And soon after, the material symbol of this idea followed suit. Karakoram, the first capital, built by Ogadai, the very heart of the steppe world, was first plundered and burned during internecine wars, then finally destroyed by Chinese forces. The city from which half the world was once governed dissolved into silent ruins, gradually engulfed by sand. This was the final somber chord. The heart of the empire ceased to beat. The great system, no longer possessing a single center or a unified purpose, finally perished, leaving behind only a handful of warring successor states, each destined to live out its own, vastly different history. After the colossal empire crumbled, centuries of oblivion followed. The memory of the Mongols, much like their capital Karakoram, was almost entirely obliterated and buried under the sands of time. The very peoples they had conquered exerted Herculean efforts to erase this chapter from their own histories, or to rewrite it in the darkest, most unflattering hues. In China, the new Ming dynasty, which had overthrown the Mongol rulers, orchestrated a total demongolization. Everything associated with the Yuan dynasty was declared barbaric and alien, and the Great Wall of China was further extended and fortified, standing as an eternal stone testament to the rejection of the steppe world. In Russia, the Tatar-Mongol yoke became a central national myth, a dark age, an era of humiliation and enslavement that allegedly stifled the country's development for centuries. All memory of Pax Mongolica, of safe trade routes and religious tolerance, was completely expunged. All that remained was the image of the ruthless enslaver. This erasure was so absolute because the Mongols themselves had lost their voice. Their greatest historical and literary monument, The Secret History of the Mongols, was precisely what its name implied, a clandestine book intended solely for members of the ruling lineage. It was never meant for public consumption. When the empire collapsed and the Mongols themselves reverted to their nomadic ways, the original text, written in Mongolian, was lost. For nearly 6 centuries, the world knew of Genghis Khan and his empire only through second-hand accounts from Persian, Chinese, Armenian, and Russian chronicles. That is to say, exclusively from sources penned by their enemies or their subjects. This would be akin to studying the history of the Roman Empire by reading only the scattered notes of Gallic and Germanic chieftains. The Mongols were reduced to mere objects in others' narratives, transforming into the demons of others' mythologies. The moment of rediscovery only dawned in the 18th and 19th centuries in Europe during the Age of Enlightenment. Scholars, like Edward Gibbon, for the first time attempted to view the Mongols not as a divine scourge, but as a historical phenomenon. Their questions shifted from why to how. How did a mere handful of nomads manage to crush mighty civilizations? How did they manage to govern such vast territories? The real breakthrough occurred when European Orientalists gained access to Persian archives and uncovered Rashid al-Din's monumental work, the Compendium of Chronicles. It was a shock. What lay before them was not just a chronicle, but the very first attempt in history to write a global history, and it had been penned at the court of the Mongol Ilkhans by their direct commission. And when, in the 19th century, Chinese transcriptions of the secret history were unearthed and deciphered, the Mongols finally spoke in their own authentic voice. The effect was akin to an explosion. Historians suddenly saw not just a horde of destroyers, but an incredibly complex administrative machine, brilliant logistics, pragmatic politics, and even a nascent form of 13th century globalization. The term Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace, itself entered common parlance. It turned out that under the rule of these barbarians, trade flourished, missionaries and merchants traveled safely, and their courts offered sanctuary to scholars and artisans from every corner of the globe. The image of Genghis Khan began its transformation from a one-dimensional villain into a complex, contradictory, and truly monumental figure of global significance. This was a complete re-evaluation of values, one of the greatest intellectual revolutions in historical scholarship. But, as is so often the case, each new era read the legacy of the Mongols in its own particular way, imbuing it with meanings that were never there to begin with. The 20th century, with its cult of total power and iron fist ideologies, saw in Genghis Khan its own dark ideal. Totalitarian leaders admired not his administrative genius, but his terrifying ability to cement a nation with a single will, his ruthless efficiency, and his unapologetic use of terror as an instrument of state policy. They saw in him an example of how one superhuman individual could redraw the world map, utterly disregarding any moral norms. This was the most chilling and dangerous interpretation, tearing brutality from its historical context and transforming it into an end in itself. Our own time has birthed its own, no less peculiar, interpretation. In the 21st century, Genghis Khan has unexpectedly become a hero of business literature. He is presented as a brilliant CEO, a master of startups who built a corporation from scratch. His military campaigns are analyzed as dazzling marketing strategies, and the Yasa law as an ideal corporate code. This rendition, for all its superficial appeal, is just as far from the truth. It reduces a profoundly complex historical phenomenon, steeped in blood, religion, and geopolitics, to a set of oversimplified leadership lessons. Thus, having navigated through centuries of oblivion and rediscovery, the figure of the Steppe Khan continues to live on, transforming into an eternal mirror in which each epoch sees the reflection of its own fears, ambitions, and misconceptions. And so, having traversed this immense journey from a funeral cart on the banks of the Onon River to modern satellite images, we now come full circle. We began with a paradox. How could the most powerful empire of its time be born from the chaos of fragmented nomadic tribes who had for centuries feuded amongst themselves over pastures and livestock? Genghis Khan brought an iron order to this world, a unified law and a singular purpose. He replaced the petty, endless war of all against all with one, yet total war for global dominion. And now, let us observe what became of it all in the end. After the empire's collapse, his descendants, the rulers of the Ulusis, once again plunged into the very same internecine squabbling from which it all began. Only now, they fought not over pastures, but over entire kingdoms. The grand project to establish world order concluded with a return to primeval chaos, but on a new, far more bloody and destructive level. And therein lies the core, the intractable paradox woven throughout this monumental saga. The relentless quest for absolute total order inevitably spawns the most brutal and uncontrollable chaos. A system designed to put an end to warfare at its very zenith, unleashed the most devastating conflicts known to history. The lofty vision of uniting humanity under a single sky fractured it into irreconcilable civilizational blocks. And finally, the ambitious project to forge an eternal mystery intended to grant everlasting peace instead birthed the loudest, most restless form of immortality, morphing into an enduring obsession for thousands of seekers across the globe. Genghis Khan's legacy is much like his fabled, unseen tomb. We know it's out there, its immense influence undeniable, yet we cannot touch it, nor can we render a definitive judgment. Was he the visionary genius who unified Eurasia and forged the first truly global system, or a bloodthirsty tyrant who plunged the world into an abyss of slaughter? The answer, unequivocally, is both. He was a force of nature, akin to an earthquake, that tore down the old world to its very foundations, allowing something entirely new to rise from its rubble. And this profound duality, this very impossibility of delivering a definitive verdict, stands as his ultimate legacy. We have unraveled the mechanics of the marvel. We have grasped the engineering logic that underpinned the creation of the mystery. We have seen that it was not magic, but rather cold calculation, an unprecedented will and monstrous cruelty that lay behind it. But knowing how it was accomplished doesn't negate the paramount question: why? Why such a colossal, titanic undertaking? Was it merely to safeguard the bones of a single, albeit great, individual? Or did something far grander lie beneath the surface? Perhaps the architects of this enduring mystery intuitively grasped what we, today, are only just beginning to suspect. They understood that civilization thrives not just on the illuminating glow of knowledge, but also on the profound shadow of mystery. That there must exist boundaries which human curiosity ought not to transgress. That a complete absence of enigmas, a state of total transparency, is not paradise, but a desolate wilderness where imagination withers and faith dies. And so they erected this monument to the unknown, not solely for their revered Khan, but for all of humankind. As an eternal reminder that not everything in this world is meant to be discovered, catalogued, and explained away. And contemplating all this colossal 8th century cycle from its genesis to our present day evokes the central, final question. Is history merely a spiral where we, on a new technological loop, are fated to repeat the very same fundamental errors, constructing empires destined to crumble under their own immense weight, relentlessly pursuing order only to unleash chaos, and striving to solve mysteries that perhaps were never meant to be unraveled? Or does humanity, after all, possess the chance to break free from this grand cycle, finally internalizing the profound lesson silently imparted by that undiscovered tomb in the Mongolian steppe?